In the shadows of Florence, where political intrigue flowed through cobblestone streets like morning mist, a young merchant named Lorenzo found himself stripped of everything he had built. His trading house, once prosperous enough to rival the Medici banks, lay in ruins. His name, previously spoken with respect in the halls of commerce, now carried whispers of scandal and failure. The betrayal had come from those he trusted most, his business partner who had systematically embezzled funds while maintaining the facade of loyalty, and the political allies who had abandoned him the moment his influence waned. Standing in his empty villa, surrounded by the echoes of what once was, Lorenzo faced a choice that would define not merely his future, but his very essence. The conventional path beckoned him toward immediate action: public declarations of innocence, desperate attempts to salvage his reputation, frantic efforts to rebuild what others had destroyed. Yet something deeper, something that had been forged in the crucible of his downfall, whispered of a different way, the path that required the courage to embrace silence as strategy, weakness as transformation, and destruction as creation. The concept of rebuilding in silence is not merely tactical retreat, it is the profound recognition that true power emerges not from the preservation of what we were, but from the deliberate destruction of our weaker selves. This principle, woven through the fabric of Machiavellian thought, suggests that the individual who can systematically dismantle their own vulnerabilities, vanities, and dependencies becomes fundamentally unassailable by external forces. For how can others destroy what has already been willingly sacrificed on the altar of self-transformation? Lorenzo's journey began with the hardest recognition of all, that his downfall was not merely the result of external betrayal, but the inevitable consequence of his own internal weaknesses. He had built his empire on foundations of ego and appearance rather than substance and strategy. His need for public validation had made him predictable, his desire for immediate gratification had made him vulnerable to manipulation, his attachment to a particular image of success had blinded him to the shifting currents of power that surrounded him. In the Machiavellian framework, the prince who wishes to maintain power must be willing to be both lion and fox, to possess both the strength to confront direct challenges and the cunning to navigate the labyrinth of human deception. But, before one can master these external qualities, one must first become the architect of one's own character, deliberately destroying those aspects of the self that invite destruction from others. The first phase of Lorenzo's transformation required him to embrace what appeared to be complete social death. While others in his position might have immediately sought new alliances or attempted to restore their former status, Lorenzo chose differently. He withdrew from the public sphere entirely, allowing the rumors and speculation about his fate to flourish without contradiction or clarification. This silence was not born of shame or defeat, but of profound strategic calculation. In silence, he began the work of honest self-examination that success had previously made impossible. Each failure was dissected not with self-pity but with the cold precision of a surgeon. His need for external validation, where had it originated, and how had it shaped his decisions? His tendency toward trust based on sentiment rather than evidence, when had this pattern established itself, and what blind spots had it created? His attachment to a particular lifestyle and status, how had these desires made him vulnerable to those who could threaten or promise to fulfill them? This process of self-demolition extended beyond mere introspection. Lorenzo began systematically destroying the habits, relationships, and thought patterns that had characterized his previous existence. He sold the remaining assets that tied him to his former identity. He severed connections with individuals who knew him only in the context of his previous success. He abandoned the routines and environments that reinforced his old ways of thinking and being. This was not the random destruction of despair, but the calculated demolition that precedes deliberate reconstruction. Like a master architect who must sometimes tear down a flawed foundation to build something truly enduring, Lorenzo was engaged in the most sophisticated form of strategic planning, the complete reimagining of the self as a fortress that cannot be breached because it contains no weaknesses that enemies can exploit. The wisdom embedded in this approach reflects a deeper understanding of human nature and power dynamics than is typically acknowledged in conventional thinking about success and resilience. Most people, when faced with setbacks, attempt to restore what was lost. They fight to reclaim their former position, to prove their worth to those who doubted them, to rebuild the same structures that failed them. This approach, while psychologically understandable, is strategically flawed because it assumes that the original construction was sound and that failure was merely the result of temporary circumstances or external interference. The Machiavellian perspective suggests something far more radical, that most failures are not external accidents but internal inevitabilities, the natural consequences of flaws in our character, judgment, or strategic thinking that were always present but hidden by temporary success. To rebuild the same structure is to guarantee the same eventual failure. True strategic thinking requires the courage to acknowledge that we ourselves were the primary architects of our own downfall, and that lasting power can only be built on the foundation of a self that has been consciously reconstructed from first principles. During his period of withdrawal, Lorenzo discovered that silence itself possessed a power he had never previously understood. In a world where most people feel compelled to explain, justify, and defend themselves constantly, the individual who can remain quiet while others speculate becomes a figure of mystery and intrigue. His former enemies, who had expected him to fight back immediately, found themselves unsettled by his absence from the battlefield they had prepared for him. His absence became more powerful than his presence had ever been, because it forced others to create narratives about his intentions and capabilities without the benefit of current information. This strategic use of silence extended beyond mere public relations. In the quiet space he had created, Lorenzo could observe the world around him with a clarity that had been impossible during the noise and urgency of his previous life. He watched how power actually flowed in the city, noting the difference between official hierarchies and real influence. He studied the individuals who had remained successful over time, identifying the patterns that distinguish temporary achievers from enduring powers. He analyzed his former enemies and allies alike, understanding for the first time the motivations and vulnerabilities that drove their actions. Most importantly, he observed himself with the same dispassionate attention he directed toward others. In silence, away from the reactive pressures of social and professional life, he could see clearly which of his thoughts and emotions served his long-term interests and which were merely the products of conditioning, fear, or ego. He began to distinguish between his authentic strategic intelligence and the noise of social programming that had previously masqueraded as his own thinking. The second phase of Lorenzo's transformation involved the systematic reconstruction of his character according to principles of strategic effectiveness rather than social acceptability. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his journey, because it required him to abandon not only his previous weaknesses but also many qualities that society had taught him to value. His natural inclination toward trust, for instance, had been praised as a virtue in his youth and had indeed contributed to some of his early successes. People were drawn to his openness and apparent sincerity. But Lorenzo came to understand that undiscriminating trust was not actually a virtue but a form of laziness and unwillingness to do the hard work of evaluating people's true motivations and capabilities. The reconstructed Lorenzo would practice what Machiavelli described as prudent suspicion, not cynical distrust that assumes the worst of everyone, but intelligent caution that verifies rather than assumes, that evaluates people based on their actions over time rather than their words or initial impressions. Similarly, his desire to be liked and admired had to be recognized not as an admirable quality but as a strategic weakness that made him manipulable by anyone who understood how to provide or threaten the approval he craved. The new Lorenzo would need to develop what he came to think of as strategic indifference, not the inability to form genuine connections with others, but the freedom from needing others' approval to maintain his sense of self-worth and direction. This reconstruction required Lorenzo to develop entirely new relationships with fundamental human experiences, success and failure, love and hatred, hope and fear. Instead of experiencing these as emotional reactions that happened to him, he began to understand them as information that could inform his strategic thinking. Success became not a reason for celebration but a signal to examine what conditions had aligned to produce this result and how they might be maintained or replicated. Failure became not a source of shame but valuable data about flawed assumptions or inadequate preparation. Perhaps most radically, Lorenzo began to reconstruct his relationship with his own identity. Previously, he had understood himself as a merchant, a Florentine, a member of certain social circles, identities that carried both privileges and limitations, both opportunities and vulnerabilities. His downfall had come partly because his enemies understood these identities better than he did and had crafted their attacks to exploit the weaknesses inherent in each role. The reconstructed Lorenzo would think of himself primarily as a strategic intelligence inhabiting various roles as circumstances required. Like an actor who can play different characters convincingly without being imprisoned by any single role, he would learn to move between different social contexts and identities fluidly, adopting whatever personas served his long-term objectives while maintaining an inner core that remained independent of external circumstances. This transformation extended to his relationship with material possessions and social status. Previously, these had been both goals in themselves and measures of his worth. Their loss had been devastating precisely because he had allowed them to become integrated with his sense of self. The new Lorenzo would understand wealth and status as tools useful when they served his purposes, expendable when they did not, never to be confused with his actual value or power. The third phase of Lorenzo's journey involved his strategic re-emergence into the world, but as a fundamentally different kind of player than he had been before. This was not a return to his former position but the debut of an entirely new approach to power and influence. The man who emerged from his period of reconstruction bore little resemblance to the merchant who had been destroyed 3 years earlier. His first moves were small, almost imperceptible to those who might have been watching for signs of his return. He began with information, carefully cultivating sources among people who were overlooked or undervalued by the existing power structure. Servants, clerks, minor officials, traveling merchants, people who saw everything but were noticed by no one. From these sources, he began to build a comprehensive understanding of the current political and economic landscape that was far more accurate and detailed than what was available to those who relied on official channels or social gossip. With this information advantage, Lorenzo began to make strategic interventions in situations where a small action could produce disproportionate results. A warning delivered anonymously to a minor official about a plot against him. A piece of financial intelligence shared with a struggling merchant family. The introduction of two parties who could benefit from knowing each other but who moved in different circles. Each intervention was designed to create gratitude and obligation without revealing the source, building a network of influence based on results rather than reputation. This approach reflected one of the most sophisticated aspects of Machiavellian strategy, the understanding that real power often operates invisibly, through influence rather than authority, through the creation of conditions rather than direct commands. Lorenzo was learning to become what intelligence professionals might call a force multiplier, someone whose true impact far exceeds their apparent position or resources because they understand how to work through systems and networks rather than against them. As his influence grew, Lorenzo faced the crucial test that determines whether someone has truly mastered the principles of strategic reconstruction, the temptation to return to his former patterns of thinking and acting. Opportunities arose that would have allowed him to reclaim something resembling his previous status. Former allies, sensing his growing influence, reached out to suggest partnerships. His enemies, beginning to understand that he represented a new kind of threat, offered truces and accommodations. The old Lorenzo would have been tempted by these offers, seeing them as validation of his worth and evidence of his successful comeback. But the reconstructed Lorenzo understood them as tests of whether he had truly destroyed his former weaknesses or merely hidden them temporarily. He declined overtures that would have required him to operate according to other people's expectations or to accept positions that looked impressive but carried limiting obligations. Instead, he continued to build his influence according to his own design, creating a form of power that was less visible but more durable than what he had possessed before. He became known not for wealth or title but for results, for the ability to make things happen, to solve problems, to create opportunities. People sought his advice and assistance not because of his official position but because of his demonstrated effectiveness. This transformation of reputation from status-based to competence-based represented a fundamental shift in the nature of his power. Status-based power is always vulnerable because it depends on external recognition and can be damaged by attacks on reputation or changes in social dynamics. Competence-based power is much more difficult to destroy because it is grounded in demonstrable ability to produce results that others value. Lorenzo's approach to relationships also reflected his strategic reconstruction. Rather than seeking to be liked or admired, he focused on being useful and reliable. He made commitments carefully but honored them completely. He avoided becoming indebted to others when possible, and, when he did accept assistance, he ensured that he provided value in return rather than simply expressing gratitude. His relationships became characterized by mutual benefit and clear understanding rather than sentiment and assumption. This shift represented a mature understanding of how durable alliances are actually formed. Emotional bonds, while psychologically satisfying, are inherently unstable because emotions change and can be manipulated by third parties. Relationships based on clear mutual advantage are more reliable because they align people's long-term interests rather than depending on their current feelings. The strategic principles that guided Lorenzo's transformation can be understood as a practical application of deeper philosophical insights about the nature of human strength and vulnerability. The conventional understanding of resilience focuses on the ability to withstand external pressures without changing, to maintain one's position and identity despite challenges. This approach, while sometimes effective in the short term, is fundamentally reactive and defensive. The Machiavellian approach to resilience is proactive and creative. It recognizes that true strength comes not from the ability to resist change but from the capacity to direct change according to strategic objectives. The individual who can consciously restructure their own character, priorities, and methods is practicing the highest form of strategic thinking because they are taking control of the variables that determine their long-term effectiveness. This approach requires a fundamental shift in how one thinks about the relationship between self and circumstances. Most people understand themselves as fixed entities trying to navigate changing external conditions. They develop strategies for protecting their existing identity and interests against various threats and opportunities. This defensive posture, while psychologically comfortable, is strategically limiting because it assumes that their current self represents the optimal configuration for dealing with an uncertain future. The Machiavellian perspective suggests that the self is itself a strategic asset that can and should be consciously designed to maximize effectiveness across a wide range of possible circumstances. This doesn't mean abandoning authentic values or becoming manipulative, but rather developing the capacity to express one's core purposes through whatever methods and personas are most effective in different situations. Lorenzo discovered that this approach to self-development created a form of confidence that was qualitatively different from what he had possessed before his downfall. His previous confidence had been based on external validation and past successes, sources that made it vulnerable to attack and dependent on continuing favorable circumstances. His reconstructed confidence was based on his demonstrated ability to adapt and rebuild regardless of external conditions, a source that became stronger rather than weaker under pressure. This shift had profound implications for how others perceived and interacted with him. People can sense the difference between confidence that depends on external circumstances and confidence that emerges from inner resourcefulness. The former invites challenge and manipulation because others understand that it can be destabilized by attacking its external sources. The latter commands a different kind of respect because it signals that the individual will find a way to succeed regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. As Lorenzo's influence continued to expand, he began to understand how the principles of strategic reconstruction could be applied not just to individual development but to the building of organizations and systems. Just as he had learned to destroy and rebuild his own character according to strategic principles, he could help others, businesses, political organizations, even cities identify and eliminate their structural vulnerabilities while building new capabilities that were aligned with their long-term objectives. This insight opened up possibilities for impact that went far beyond personal success or revenge against those who had wronged him. Lorenzo began to envision himself not as someone who was trying to reclaim his position within existing systems, but as someone who could help create new and better systems altogether. This vision required him to think beyond the conventional boundaries of individual ambition and consider how his strategic capabilities could serve larger purposes. The city of Florence itself, Lorenzo came to understand, was caught in patterns of political and economic thinking that were becoming obsolete as the world around it changed. The traditional alliances and assumptions that had guided Florentine policy were increasingly inadequate for dealing with new challenges from emerging powers, changing trade routes, and evolving technologies. The city needed the kind of strategic reconstruction that Lorenzo had applied to himself, a willingness to abandon failing approaches and rebuild according to new principles that were better adapted to emerging realities. This realization led Lorenzo to perhaps the most ambitious aspect of his transformation, the decision to use his reconstructed capabilities not primarily for personal gain but for systemic improvement. He began to work behind the scenes to introduce new ideas and approaches that could help Florence adapt to changing circumstances while preserving what was most valuable about its culture and traditions. This choice reflected a mature understanding of how individual and collective interests interact. Lorenzo had learned that his own long-term success was inseparable from the health of the systems within which he operated. A strategy focused purely on individual advantage would ultimately be self-limiting because it would contribute to the degradation of the environment that made his success possible. True strategic thinking required him to consider how his actions affected the overall system and to align his methods with approaches that strengthened rather than weakened the foundations of collective prosperity. The transformation that Lorenzo had undergone represented more than personal development or strategic repositioning. It embodied a fundamental principle about the nature of human potential and the relationship between individual and collective power. The individual who can consciously reconstruct their own character according to strategic principles demonstrates a form of sovereignty that transcends conventional categories of success and failure. This sovereignty emerges from the recognition that our greatest vulnerabilities are often not external circumstances but internal patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting that make us predictable and manipulable by others. The person who can identify and modify these patterns according to strategic objectives possesses a form of freedom that cannot be taken away by external forces because it is not dependent on external circumstances. But this individual sovereignty, rather than leading to isolation or selfishness, actually creates the foundation for more effective and ethical forms of collective action. The person who is not driven by unconscious needs for validation, security, or status can make decisions based on what actually serves long-term interests rather than what provides immediate emotional satisfaction. They can form alliances based on shared objectives rather than personal dependence, and they can contribute to collective efforts without needing to receive credit or control outcomes. Lorenzo's journey from destruction to reconstruction illustrated how apparent defeat can become the foundation for a more sophisticated and durable form of success. By willingly destroying those aspects of himself that invited destruction from others, he had created a character that was simultaneously more effective and more ethical than what he had possessed before. He had learned to pursue power not as an end in itself but as a means of creating conditions that served purposes larger than his immediate interests. The silence that had characterized the beginning of his transformation had taught him that real influence often operates below the threshold of public recognition. The most important changes happen not through dramatic gestures that capture attention but through patient, systematic work that gradually shifts the conditions within which others operate. This understanding had freed him from the need to seek immediate recognition or vindication, allowing him to focus on building capabilities and relationships that would serve his long-term objectives. Perhaps most significantly, Lorenzo had discovered that the process of strategic self-reconstruction was not something that could be completed and then set aside. It was an ongoing practice that required constant attention and refinement. Each new challenge and opportunity provided information about additional areas where his character or methods could be improved. Each success created new vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed before they could be exploited by others. This recognition transformed his understanding of what it meant to be powerful. Power was not a possession that could be acquired and defended but a dynamic capability that had to be continuously developed and adapted to changing circumstances. The individual who understood this could remain effective across a wide range of situations because they were committed to learning and growing rather than protecting a fixed position or identity. Years after beginning his journey of reconstruction, Lorenzo found himself in a position that would have been unimaginable during his period of apparent defeat. He had become not just individually successful but instrumentally important to the prosperity and security of his community. His influence operated through networks of relationships and understanding rather than formal authority, making it simultaneously more extensive and more subtle than traditional forms of power. More importantly, he had developed a way of thinking and acting that was inherently sustainable. Because his methods were based on creating value for others rather than extracting it, they strengthened rather than depleted the systems within which he operated. Because his confidence was based on demonstrated adaptability rather than fixed assets, it grew rather than diminished under pressure. Because his relationships were based on mutual benefit rather than dependency, they became more valuable over time rather than becoming burdensome or manipulative. The man who had emerged from the process of strategic reconstruction bore little resemblance to the merchant who had been destroyed years earlier. But this transformation represented not the replacement of one person by another but the revelation of capacities that had always been present but had been hidden by conditioning, fear, and limited thinking. Lorenzo had not become someone else, he had become more fully himself by removing the obstacles that had prevented him from expressing his authentic capabilities. This distinction is crucial for understanding the Machiavellian approach to self-development. It is not about manipulation or deception but about the removal of internal barriers that prevent us from thinking clearly and acting effectively. The individual who can see reality without the distortions of ego, fear, or wishful thinking is naturally more capable of making decisions that serve their genuine interests and the interests of those they care about. The strategic path to power that Lorenzo had followed was available to anyone willing to pay the price of honest self-examination and systematic reconstruction. It required the courage to acknowledge and abandon failing patterns, the patience to rebuild according to new principles, and the wisdom to understand that real strength emerges not from the preservation of weakness but from its deliberate transformation. In the end, Lorenzo had discovered that the individual who destroys their weak self cannot be destroyed by others because they have eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that external enemies depend upon to cause damage. They have become like a well-designed fortress that presents no weaknesses for attackers to exploit, not because it is heavily defended but because it has been constructed according to principles that make attack ineffective. This form of invulnerability, rather than making one isolated or defensive, actually makes possible a more generous and creative engagement with the world. When one is not constantly protecting weaknesses, energy becomes available for building rather than defending, for creating rather than preserving, for serving larger purposes rather than managing personal insecurities. The silence in which Lorenzo had rebuilt himself had been not the silence of defeat but the silence of concentration, the quietness required for the most important work of crafting a character capable of sustained effectiveness in an uncertain world. From that silence had emerged not just personal success but a model for how individuals can develop the kind of inner strength that serves both their own authentic interests and the common good. This is the ultimate teaching of the Machiavellian approach to power, that true strength serves not just individual advancement but the creation of conditions within which human potential can flourish. The person who has mastered the art of strategic self-reconstruction becomes capable of contributing to the reconstruction of the world itself, building systems and relationships that are more just, more effective, and more aligned with the deeper purposes that give meaning to human existence. The path that begins with the destruction of one's weak self ultimately leads to the construction of a stronger world, a world that reflects the best possibilities of human intelligence, creativity, and cooperation. This is why the strategic path to power, properly understood, is not about domination but about liberation, the freeing of human potential from the internal and external obstacles that prevent its full expression.